Hi everybody, it's Brad. I'm a bookseller here at University Bookstore, and I wanted to make some recommendations. Now, a couple people have asked me why I haven't recommended fiction other than short stories so far, and there's an easy answer to that. It's weird though. During the pandemic, when I was home on furlough, I found it really difficult to read fiction, which is strange because it's mostly what I read. I mean, I do read other things, essays and history and biography and so on, obviously, but fiction's the primary source of entertainment. So why? Turns out I just could not care about imaginary persons during that crisis, that still ongoing crisis. So when I came back, I decided to give it a go again, and I found that about the perfect thing for me in terms of fiction nowadays are short novels or novellas. My commitment is such that it'll last out that. Now, I also had access to new books again for the first time in a year, and that was heaven in every conceivable way. It still is. But some of the new books I had access to, at least in terms of novels, fell into a category I think of as jerk fiction. Now, that doesn't mean deliciously, highly spiced Jamaican settings. What that means is there's a central character who's basically a bit of a dick, and we're supposed to sympathize and identify with him. And if not, we're at least supposed to sort of, good-heartedly accept that people are strange and behave badly, and I don't know, it's meant to make us feel that the character is imperfect in ways with which we may identify ourselves. It never works for me. It used to be an almost exclusively male habit to have protagonists who were jerks. At least two of the books I picked up since I came back prove that that's no longer true, which I guess is kind of a sign of progress, that now there can be jerks of different sex and gender. Still, not to my taste. If I'm going to spend time with somebody, I want to be able, if not to like them, at least to feel sympathy with them. And if you're the person who's demanding things from other people or can't understand why the world isn't the way you want it to be when it should be, well, I would have a hard time having that conversation with you in real life, let alone in the form of a novel. So instead, I picked up novellas, and novellas tend to be short novels, and it's a form very popular in my experience, my reading experience, with women writers. The first thing I picked up was by an author whose earlier book, called Breasts and Eggs, I read on someone's recommendation. Strange, very good, and this was the new one. It's called Heaven, a novel. Kawakami, Miyako Kawakami. I hope I'm doing her justice with her name. I don't usually. It's from Europa Editions. And this is a story that, again, I probably would not have picked up had I not read the earlier one, because it's about junior high age kids being bullied. I had some experience of that. I don't necessarily want to read about it again in a book, but she just writes beautifully in a very clear and yet occasionally rather lyric style. And this is told from the perspective of this boy who has a slight physical disability that has made him stand out enough to be bullied. He has a wandering eye, and so that becomes his nickname, Eyes. And if it was just that, if it was just him being bullied for almost 200 pages, I wouldn't have finished it. But then an interesting thing happens. There's a girl in his class who is also much bullied and very odd, even to him. And one day he gets a note, and they end up being first correspondents and then friends. Another thing that's been difficult for me is that I've found it almost impossible to read novels with 16 or 14-year-old protagonists with any pleasure. It's been a long time since I was a teenager. And plus, I never understood why we want teenage protagonists. And then it finally dawned on me, and I may have mentioned this before, in classic fiction, say Trollope or Austen, there are all these social conventions that get in the way of people saying what they mean or doing what they most want to do. And since those social conventions are largely gone, now what you have to have is somebody who has similar difficulties articulating their desires, well, thus teenagers. Anyway, she does that beautifully here. One of the things that she achieves is that in the notes that they exchange and later in the conversations that these two characters have, she very much captures both the wild enthusiasm and, frankly, the terror of rejection that is involved in almost every communication between shy persons and especially teenagers. But this is from fairly early on in the novel. I just wanted to read a brief passage. I wanted to know what this heaven place was all about and to see where she was planning to take me. But what excited me the most was the two of us were meeting up and going off somewhere together. I had no idea what I should bring or what to wear or how much money I would need. What to wear bugged me the most. I had never really given clothes much thought. I just wore whatever my mom bought me without worrying about it. My hard-won conclusion was that I shouldn't wear something that had a pattern. That didn't leave me with many options, but I spent hours on end trying to plan my outfit. I finally settled on a navy crewneck t-shirt, some jeans I'd been wearing since last year, and the Converse high tops I wore outside of school. Still, I couldn't convince myself that this was the right choice. There was no one around for me to ask, but even with the clothing question solved for now, I still had to figure out the money. What I had left from New Year's and saved from my monthly allowance came to about 10,000 yen. Counting out the bills gave me a momentary confidence. I slipped the bills into my wallet and put it in my pocket to see how it would feel. I felt bigger. I felt like I could walk tall. Yeah, I was sure that this would be enough to deal with whatever came our way. Then I went back to worrying about clothes. Well, that very much captures what I remember of my teenage thinking. As I said, it is a story about bullying, so one does have to be aware. If that's a trigger for you, you may want to avoid this novel, because there are difficult passages of physical abuse and psychological torment. And I can't say that it ends in triumph, but it does end in a touching and hopeful place. The next one I wanted to mention is by a writer that I love and that I've read for years, and her name is Natalia Ginzburg. This is a new book, a new issue from New Directions. And it's one I hadn't read before. I only discovered it because I came back. It's called Voices in the Evening. And what Natalia Ginzburg does, in a very spare style, for American references, you might want to think of Ann Beatty or Raymond Carver. She tells lives. That's what she does. These are the characters, this is where they live, this is the time it is. And there's a lot of them in a very narrow little book, because she's describing an entire town, basically, or at least a neighborhood. And so you do get backstories on people you may not meet again. And because of the setting, because it's post-war Italy, sometimes those stories are really harsh. But she says them straight up and straight out. This is that girl, and that's what happened to her, and that's why the marriage didn't work. The tone can be sort of conversationally gossipy, and the narrator here is an unmarried woman with an education, sort of trapped in a family dynamic that she doesn't control. This is just a brief passage about her mother. My mother is always lamenting that her children are so far away. She often goes off to have a cry over it with her friend, Signora Ninetta Bottaglia. All the same, she gets some satisfaction out of shedding these tears. They feed her self-esteem, since there is mingled with them some pride in having sent her offspring to such remote and perilous places. But my mother's most persistent worry is that I do not get married. This is an annoyance which depresses her, and the only consolation she gets lies in the fact that the little Battaglia girls at the age of 30 have not got married either. Yeah. Lots of people will identify with the narrator of this book, and Ginsberg's story of her own experience during the war and her survival and the loss of her husband, who was tortured to death by the Nazis, it informs both her outlook and her attitude. There is a fatalism in Natalia Ginsberg, but there is also a fundamentally Italian, if that doesn't sound too simplistic, embrace of life and a desire for more. It informs everything she ever wrote, however grim or funny, tend to be a mix of both, and this is no exception. This is a fairly late book for Ginsberg, and like many writers who start off spare, she gets whittled down to bone by the time you read this. There's no extraneous matter. If she tells you something, it's because this is something you should know. She's a brilliant writer, and if you haven't read her before, do try. And finally, speaking of brilliant writers, this is somebody I only discovered with their last book and then had to go back and find others. Her name is Sigrid Nunez, and her last book was called The Friend, and it got nominated for a lot of awards, and it involved somebody inheriting a great big dog. And it was mind-blowingly good. And this is her latest, which came out some time back while I was on furlough. It's called What Are You Going Through? And it's from Riverhead Books. And in this story, the narrator, who, it's difficult not to think of her as Sigrid Nunez, although she doesn't say that, but in my head, me and Sigrid are friends now, and she's talking to me about her own experience. It's not true. She's a novelist. She always creates a character. But in this instance, the central character is asked by a friend to help her with something very difficult, and her friend is ill. She goes to see her in the hospital, her friend. About an hour into my visit, we were interrupted by her oncologist, a youthful and classically handsome brown man, like a movie star cast as the hero doctor, and I was touched to see how she flirted with him, and how he, subtly, good-naturedly, flirted back, before I was asked to step out of the room. A private room. "You won't believe what this is costing," she told me, but I couldn't bear the idea of lying here all day with some roommate watching TV or gabbing on the phone. I can't stand it even for a few minutes in the lounge. And I, in turn, told her about being in the hospital overnight for minor surgery the year before, and how I'd had to listen for hours to the woman in the next bed phoning updates on her condition to an endless series of people, including her hairdresser and, weirdly enough, one apparently bewildered person to whom she had to explain how it was that they knew each other. Well, if you've ever been in the hospital, and I have been recently, that's very much the experience of sharing a room with someone. Sigrid Nunez is an intellectual, and so she's never just telling you a story. And her technique, especially in these last two books, is to go off on divergent, seemingly divergent subjects or occasions. And at times, even in a short novel, you can wonder where she's wandering. There, wasn't that clever? I saved that. Where she's wandering to, in this instance, is a consideration of mortality and friendship and love, and how do we help the people we most want to help? And sometimes they aren't even the people we assume we would spend this portion of our lives with. Sometimes they're other people who came later, or who we had largely forgotten and who come back. How do we help ourselves and our friends deal with that final journey? it's full of surprises and very careful and sometimes amusing, sometimes quite moving thoughts on very important subjects. The fact that she can do all of this in such a short space is mind-blowing. And it's one of the reasons why these short novels appeal to me. All three of them are about things that matter, and they take their time, even though time is one of the features of this form. How much can happen in what turns out to be a very short time. Our time, for now, seems to be over, and that's fine. All three of these I would recommend highly. All new, all by women as it turns out, which wasn't a theme I had in mind, but that's a good thing too. Oh, and two of them in translation. It is Fiction in Translation Month, as I recall. All the better. Anyway, thanks. I'll talk to you again soon.